I am joined as always by Mr. Anthony Treash. We are talking top 10 returning offensive tackles in college football. Treash, before we get going, how is Cincinnati treating you right now?
It's treating me all right, I suppose. I mean, we're just finishing up the college football preview, which we've talked a lot about already, but we're almost done, coming out less than a week. But, you know, it's nice down here. It was actually cold a little bit this morning. So not so much the muggy weather with all of those. The best part is we don't have those cicadas flying around everywhere anymore, because those things were absolutely horrendous. Were they bad up there in your neck of the woods up in Canada?
Didn't get any cicadas whatsoever.
Consider yourself lucky, because they're the most annoying things on this planet. I had one go to the bathroom on me one day. It was the worst smelling thing I've ever heard. Like their smell.
Boy,
it was horrible.
When Trudeau closed the border for traveling, he really did it so that the cicadas wouldn't come in. They know the rule. They need to stay in America. Okay, let's get into offensive tackles, and we're going to group them up in about three groups, basically. So let's get number one, number two, number three. Thayer, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Thayer Munford from Ohio State, and then we got Darian Kennard from Kentucky and Evan Neal from Alabama. So what's your take on this kind of top tier of the top offensive tackles?
Yeah, I think my biggest takeaway from this top, it was kind of interesting and difficult to pick a top guy, but I think I had to go with Thayer Munford just because what he did this past season was nothing short of exceptional from a pass protection standpoint. I mean, he went up against some really tough teams, but he was flawless. I mean, Michigan, Clemson, Alabama, he was excellent. And I thought what he did too, when they're throwing a stunner blitz his way, I mean, he was not letting anything past him at all whatsoever. You look at his pressure rate allowed, it was half a percentage point lower than any other Power 5 left tackle last season. Allowed just 3 pressures over the course of the season, no sacks or hits on Justin Fields. I mean, he was just as close to perfect as you possibly can being a left tackle for Ohio State. And that's why he's a top spot there. And I was kind of also surprised at the backlash that, people are like, Thayer Munford, that guy's really number one. And I think a lot of thing is too, just because, they're expecting someone, maybe a little bit younger, not a super senior, but I mean, this guy's a real deal. I mean, he's a well-oiled machine. I think he's the best tackle in America.
Okay, you brought up something about stunts. And it's funny because I wrote this note down when watching the 2 Ohio State players that we have in the top 10. We'll get to the other one later. But it was something that, this was kind of like the last group. Ohio State was one of the last groups that I watched. And then it kind of made clear something that I've been thinking about in football for a while, is that especially in college, there just are not a lot of one-on-ones, tackle versus edge rusher anymore, where it's like, hey, we know who's going to battle it out before the snap. And when the snap comes, that edge rusher is going to go and try and beat that offensive tackle, to get to the quarterback. Like, you just don't see that much. And a lot of it has to do with, okay, well, when are we dropping back to pass? In like a non-play action, non-screen, non-RPO way. It's really just on third down now. You just don't see it that much on first and second down. So then when we get to third down, well, here come defenses with all these stunts and pressures. And I think the game, and we both remember this game very well, is the Indiana game, where Ohio State's playing Indiana, and it's just nonstop pressure from different players. The safety, they blitz the safety, they blitz the nickel, they blitzed everybody, up the middle, and trying to create an advantage that way, rather than saying, hey, we're going to go and play one-on-one. And it's going to be a situation where the best player is going to win. It's like, no, we don't want to get in that situation. And a lot of defenses are taking that route. We don't want to get in that situation. Now, I think the SEC is probably a little bit different, because they feel like they probably have the horses there at edge to say, hey, we can go one-on-one and we can go beat tackles. We don't have to stunt, and we don't have to install a million things. We can just say, hey, we're 4 down and we can go rush the quarterback. But yeah, that was something that I noticed while watching the offensive lineman. It was just like, there's just not a lot of pure, clean one-on-ones, especially on the outside.
Yeah, exactly. When you look at a guy too like Darian Kennard, who's number 2 there, I mean, his pass protection's really not that great, but you look at what he can do in the run game, and that's why he came in there at number 2. He did, it's going to be interesting to see how he kind of fares in this new, pro style offense that they're going to run there in Kentucky. They're kind of changing things a bit what they've had in the past. But his zone blocking was some of the best in all of college football. I mean, he just was constantly wrecking guys, 6'5", 345 pounds, just, mauling them. Key instrumental guy in that rushing attack too. And Evan Neal, this guy's another unit, 6'7", 360 pounds. And I mean, he moves, pretty well, with his strength too, the length. He had some of the most big time blocks we've ever seen in a single season at the Power 5 level. Those two guys, maybe not have the most well polished data set, but you got to consider where they're coming from in the SEC. And I think that's also a concern too. You've heard us with Penei Sewell saying, he's going to be probably an elite tackle, but I don't think it's going to be a slam dunk possibly right away at the NFL level, just because you look at what he was facing, in the Pac-12. It was not that great too. And also it was a screen city over there in Oregon. I mean, it was just constant, the best edge rusher he went up against was probably in practice against Kayvon Thibodeau. So, situations like that, I think don't get talked about enough when we're talking about evaluating offensive linemen. And that's why when you hear, I don't know about you, but like me, if I'm ever talking about offensive linemen, always look up the true pass sets, always talk about the true pass sets, because those are the most important factors of looking at these guys.
So one of the things I wrote down with Evan Neal, and I think this plays into the competition level that you see in the SEC versus other conferences, is what ends up happening is, so I write down, a lot of good things, a lot of positive things, but my negative was like balance. Like sometimes, with some speed guys, he can get out, his feet can get tangled up, and then he's lunging and stuff like that. But it's like, if you put him in a different conference, if you put him in the Big Ten, if you put him in the Pac-12, would I see those balance issues? Because he's not playing against these top tier athletes who are making him sweat like that. So I wonder, it kind of just hit me, but I wonder if that's the case. Whereas, you talk about a guy like Kennard, who, is he the greatest pass protector? No. But again, that level of competition is so high because he's playing in the SEC. So if you put him in a different conference, would he, would his grades be better? Whether it's true pass set or otherwise, like would his grades be better on the passing side of things? So I think that's an interesting discussion. And I agree with you with the Penei Sewell thing. It was like, he did everything you're supposed to do when you're going to be an elite player in the NFL at college, but there was no competition. You know what I mean? He made that bad competition look even worse, but there was no competition. All right, so let's get to the next set. Jamari Sawyer from Georgia, your boy Peter Skoronski from Northwestern, and Jordan McFadden from Clemson.
I thought that was your boy, Peter Skoronski. I thought that was your top true freshman last season. No, Jamari Sawyer. I was happy to see what he did this past season for Georgia, because he was one of my biggest conviction breakout candidates. This time last offseason, we were talking about who's going to break out. You look at this guy, a small sample size darling, early on in his collegiate career, ended up becoming, he held up his part. In 2020, he could play anywhere along the offensive line. He was very good in pass protection down the stretch for Georgia, with an elite pass block rate over his last few games. And two, when he went up against Cincinnati, went over to left guard, held his own against a pretty stiff, competition there. So Jamari Sawyer comes in there at number 4. Peter Skoronski, he didn't really have, he's an interesting one too, because we're talking about the competition level, because you look at his season, you take out that Ohio State game. Yeah, he had nearly a perfect year, but then you watch that Ohio State game, you're like, this guy's a top 10 tackle. You could see the tools there for him to be special. And what he did still outside of that Ohio State game was special, because he, like I said, was nearly flawless. But then when he went up against the Buckeyes, they made him look like the true freshman that he was last season for Northwestern. But I'm very bullish on his future. I think he is one of those guys that could, break out to elite status, just because, again, no matter what the competition level is, over the duration of the entire season, it's really rare to see a tackle perform at the level that he did, as a true freshman. You don't typically see that in the Power 5 there. And then Jordan McFadden, taking on a full-time role there. He performed exceptionally well there. Did, again, falter against some of the, premier edge rushers in the ACC. And last year, that was probably the most difficult conference. And when it came to edge defenders, I mean, it was just littered from top to bottom. And that's what makes Christian Darisol's year last year so much more special when you look at what kind of pass rushes some of these guys were going up against. But he rounds out there number 6.
Yeah, my thing with Skoronski is like young. You could tell he's young. And I think that he could even get better just because I looked at him and I thought, here's a guy who needs to, maybe I'm looking too far into it, but he needs to start doing some yoga, start doing some Division I strength training where he can get some flexibility in him, and that'll, because he's strong, he's a bull, he can anchor, he can do all that good stuff. But I think with time, you're taking a guy who's already very good and you put him in an elite strength program and have him understand technique more with hand usage. I think that's where he could be tremendous. I think, true freshman, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, I mean,
he came in there tremendous. For Rashawn Slater. Wasn't even supposed to be the guy. It was supposed to be Rashawn Slater's job, and he came in. Everyone was expecting a pretty big decline, and granted, in that Ohio State game, certainly missed him. But at the end of the day, he held his own over the course of the year.
I wonder, I feel like, I don't want to project forward too negatively, but I just feel for him because we just saw Northwestern have a great season, right? Going to the Big Ten championship game. Northwestern has that type of season. It feels like once every 5 years where it's like, oh my God, Northwestern's out of nowhere. They have this really good team. So I feel bad because Skoronski had it in his first year, and it might not be so good. It might not be so good going forward. He's obviously a good player though. All right. Next group, Jack Snyder, San Jose State, Dylan Parham, Memphis, and Nicolas Petitfrère, Ohio State.
I mean,
I'm sure he doesn't go as Nicolas Petitfrère, but I'll call him that.
I don't think he does, but I was impressed with the accent. We can call him that because it sounds better. But Jack Snyder, San Jose State, our top group of 5 guy among this group. And it was kind of tough. It's offensive linemen is very tough to rank Power 5, a group of 5 together, just because it's a whole other ball game in some of these conferences. It's hell. I mean,
you put on the tape, you put on the San Jose tape and the Memphis tape after watching, Bama and Clemson and all these teams, and it's just like a totally different world.
Exactly. I mean, even too, like we were saying earlier, you compare the Pac-12 to the SEC, that's a completely different world too. I mean, it is drastically different. So it is a little bit tougher to rank these guys. But I put Jack Snyder there at number 7, just because I was very impressed with the growth that we saw from him this past season. He had a grade above 88.0 as both a pass and run blocker, en route to one of those elite marks above 90.0 that we talk about. From a true pass set perspective, his play strength, I thought, took a completely 180. He looked, he was not holding his own before last season. He was doing that this past year. And so that's why we put him there at number 7. And then Dylan Parham too. I was impressed him moving from guard to tackle, and he actually elevated his play was, fantastic. And what kind of sold me too, when he faced Cincinnati, he performed at a very high level. He did not falter. And that Cincinnati pass rushes, that's not a normal group of 5 pass rush. That's a grown man pass rush of power, better than most of the Power 5 programs. And so that's what sold me on those two. Nicolas Petitfrère, I can't get the accent on there like you can. He's another one too. He has more of like the recruiting, pedigree and background. I was very concerned, with him and Thayer Munford. I was very concerned with these two kind of entering the year, just because we hadn't seen enough from them to think that they were going to be the guys. And when the time came for them to face Penn State, if I recall correctly, it might have been the second game of the season for them. Shaka Tony, Jason, now Odafe Owe. I was very concerned with those two, just because you look at Nicolas Petitfrère, especially that first game, the one start he had back in 2019 against Northwestern. It was really bad. I mean, concerningly bad, like a liability level bad. But those two held their own. The same thing, with Petitfrère as Thayer Munford over the course of the season. He really did hold his own until the time came to face Alabama. Thayer Munford was really the only one that kind of, had a clean performance there. He did struggle a little bit, but again, it is Alabama. They have some freaks on that defensive line. And it could have been much worse. A lot of people would have been much worse.
Some guy who popped out to me while watching, I think Jamari Salyer is number 4 from Alabama. I think Chris Allen's his name. I don't know if he doesn't grade very well, but he gave some problems to Salyer, and he's a really interesting player. Ohio State. So we know the tackle play is going to be good. We know the receiver play is. I'm getting bigger picture here. We know the receiver play is going to be good. So the two issues that we don't know about, I think, is going to quarterback. Obviously, that remains to be seen. But I think the other thing is probably interior offensive line. Now they lose. We're going to fill this in later when I remember his name. Wyatt Davis. And there were issues there on the offensive line in the middle, right? We remember this. And we just talked about it in the Indiana game. They're getting pressure from all kinds of places. Even when Indiana was not even trying to get pressure, they were getting pressure up the middle. I feel like that's something that will just – it can't be as bad. It just can't be as bad because there were so many – whether they were schematic bust or mental bust, like that just won't happen again. So, that's when I was watching the Ohio State guys, I was like, man, this team, even with a new quarterback, and that quarterback will probably not be as good as 2020 and even 2019 Justin Fields, but it might not matter because A, Big Ten, and then B, the talent there on that offense is so disgusting. Like they're going to be good again. Like I know no Justin Fields, but everything else around him is really good. Okay, go ahead.
Well, yeah, too, and they also had to move some guys around. Like remember that Michigan State game when they had to put Harry Miller at center, and the snapping was absolutely horrendous. I mean, Justin Fields he could not get a clean snap to save his life. I mean, like we had, we put out on social. I was asked, top 5 offensive linemen or offensive lines returning in college football. I put Ohio State number 2, and it's mostly because of that tackle duo. Also, yeah. I think I don't think we're going to see that interior offensive line get any worse. I think it's going to be more just kind of more of an average group. And then when you have those 2 elite, clear-cut best tackle duo in college football there too, they're the second best offensive line. Like you said, there's just so much talent there. I think the big concern, nothing on the offense. I think CJ Stroud's going to come in. I think he's going to perform very well. I mean, I don't think it's going to surprise anybody. It's more the secondary, just because last year it was definitely the worst secondary of the PFF college era. I mean, it wasn't the best in America, as they said, the BIA at all whatsoever. I think Sevyn Banks, he definitely has the tools to be the guy to lead the group. But we thought the same thing about Sean Wade. He struggled. Sevyn Banks struggled last season. I think that's really the big X factor of that team. Yeah, went off on a tangent there, but
okay, I'll get to just the two group of 5 guys, and it's kind of what we were talking about is they're not big, and the whole offensive line of San Jose State not very big. The funny thing about turning on the Memphis tape for Parham was, I didn't know which, I put it on, and then I didn't know whether he was a left tackle or right tackle, and they have a pretty big left tackle. I think it's 77. He's a big dude.
Oh, so he's at TCU now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So I'm like, that must be Parham. Like that's got to be Parham, right? Like we're talking about a top 10 offensive lineman, that must be him. And then it turns out he's the other guy. He's the right tackle, and he's really small, but he's super athletic. You can see him on some bull rushes. He can get walked back a bit, but other than that, it was really elite play from him. So. Let's get to the next group, which is actually just one player, but a guy that I think we both really liked, and that's Ikem Ekwonu from NC State. For me, it was just a guy who, I thought technically was really sound and very patient in his kick step, and just shut everybody down. And like you said, the ACC, it might not be the SEC, but it's a very good pass rushing conference. So I was really excited watching the tape from Ekwonu.
Yeah, and I think the big thing for me, why he was kind of there, is just because of the run blocking. I mean, he was just a nasty run blocker. I mean, he fit that system well. I think NC State, they're a very interesting group just because it's mostly just guys that can just maul in the run game, and that's what he could do. And I think when we were talking to projecting him to the next level, he's going to be a guard more than likely. But, I'm really excited about seeing what he does. I mean, this past season, one of the 5 highest graded run blockers, 91.2 mark, and his first season starting to an 85.0 run block rate, which is really rare to see. And, he also got that mark this past season, spending some time at guard and tackle. So, I'm curious to see how he's going to kind of end up. The NC State offense is kind of intriguing to me. I know we've talked about it just a little bit. It'll be interesting to see how kind of Devin Leary fares, just because he did have a small sample and he was pretty decent in that. They have the receiving unit there, they have the offensive line. We'll see if they can piece something together, maybe beat. I wouldn't say anything like America's team Cinderella story, but they could be a trap team. They have the pieces in place to be that kind of group.
All right, there you have it. The top 10 returning offensive tackles in college football. You know where else you can find this same discussion, but on paper form? You can find it in the College Football Preview magazine that comes out June 28th, headed by the two people who you're listening to right now. So go check that out. We will talk about it again next Monday when we go through the interior offensive line rankings. All right, Treash, thanks for coming on. DraftKings Sportsbook is giving you a chance to lower the over-under on a featured playoff game. That's probably the only way I would ever win a bet. All players who place a bet on the featured basketball game will have a hand in lowering the over-under on the game. That's right. For every 1,500 players who bet the over on the select game, the over-under will drop by 1 point. DraftKings is safe and secure and reliable, so you can deposit and withdraw your funds at your convenience. Download the top-rated DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use promo code PFF when you sign up to hammer the over. For every 1,500 people that bet the over in the feature game, the line will decrease by 1 point. Yes, this is your chance to improve the odds of the over hitting. So tell your friends and family this is a team effort. Hammer the over and improve your odds of doubling your money. That's promo code PFF for a limited time only at DraftKings Sportsbook. Must be 21 or older. New Jersey, Indiana, Pennsylvania only. Restrictions apply. Max $25 wager, one per customer. Offer ends May 23rd, 2021. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details. If you have a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER or in Indiana, 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In these uncertain times, life is full of questions like, when should I start thinking about life insurance? But however difficult these questions may be, Western and Southern can help you answer them. Backed by over 130 years of experience, together we can look ahead to leave the unknown behind. Western and Southern Financial Group, life insurance, retirement, and investments. Compensated endorser, products issued by member companies of Western and Southern Financial Group, Cincinnati, Ohio. I want you guys to remember that if you are listening to this PFF podcast, we have other great podcasts on our PFF podcast network, which covers, of course, the NFL, fantasy football, and this show, college. So you can recap the NFL draft with PFF Mike and PFF Austin on 2-for-1 Drafts. Probably one of the best podcasts out there, in my opinion. You can check out Ian Hardett's fantasy football podcast and get a leg up on your league. I'm going to need it next year because I finished very poorly last season in fantasy football. And get all your 2021 betting content with the PFF forecast, another great podcast. So a lot of podcasts on the network. Make sure you tune into all of them. Okay, we are now joined by Conor McQuiston, the so-called by himself analytics czar, who also writes for Coast to Coast Scouting, to talk to us about recruiting, and in a very unique way, in a way that we haven't really talked about it before. Because Conor, you're like one of the few people that I know who is doing kind of recruiting analytics for college football. So I'm just curious, let's start off, like, how does one get into wanting to scrape 247's data and figure out, who's getting the best recruits?
So it started out by, I go to Michigan. I go to the University of Michigan. I graduate in December, which is a semester early, not late. But so like the NFL has NFL Fast Start, this public R package. That's where you see the graphs on Twitter. That's usually where people get their data from. So the analog to that in college football was CFB Scrape R. Now it's CFB Fast Start. But at the time, it was before before second semester this year in Michigan, so before winter semester. I was just bored, and I saw that we had this recruiting stuff, so I thought it'd be a fun time to make maps. So then I started making maps, and then someone else made a shiny app, like a little web applet saying like, oh, where different schools were getting their recruits from, and I had that idea, and I was kind of bitter that he did it first. So I did it instead, and then it just kind of snowballed from there.
Well, honestly, it's really your Twitter feed. You're producing some really interesting stuff, and your articles that you're writing on Coast to Coast Scouting are fascinating. Honestly, they're fascinating. So let's get into it right away. I'm going to ask you a very broad question right now.
Okay, I'm ready.
How is climate change affecting recruiting?
Yeah. So,
well, first let's say okay. I don't believe in climate change.
Okay.
So this is just, I get this entirely from your writing, your liberal writing. I don't believe in it one bit.
The lizards at the top of society just fed this misinformation to my head. I'm a lost cause, and I'm sorry, but under this lost cause, so the reason climate change is kind of a big deal in recruiting. And for the listeners that aren't familiar with my work, which is probably most of you, a lot of what I've done, especially in my writing, is I basically looked at specific metropolitan areas. Say, okay, how is what are the underlying dynamics going on in these different areas? It's like, what's the migration change? Are people moving in or out? Is there some sort of economic policy moving in that will make people want to move here? All sorts of stuff like that. Is it warm? And climate change plays into this, obviously, because ocean levels are rising and storms are getting worse. So some places are less attractive. Like in the last article I wrote, I brought up Virginia Beach and New Orleans in particular, because New Orleans, this is also affecting Miami, but New Orleans, I think the average elevation is like a foot. A lot of it's under sea level. So, if water rises at all, suddenly all the marshes around New Orleans are underwater, and the storms are getting worse and floods are getting worse. And the populations that are most affected by these floods and sea level rising are the poor Black and brown communities in these cities, which is also where a lot of the football recruits come from. So if you have these sea levels rising and places are getting harder to live in or more expensive to live in because of the sea level, and the ones that are getting affected the most are also the populations where your recruits come from, that's going to make your recruiting worse because they're going to have to leave. So that's it. Basically, people are getting flooded out is the simple way to put it.
I was going to say, even on my coast now, I was just reading something. I want to say it was either on Forbes or Washington Post, where they were talking about how all these businesses now are starting to view the desert area in the West Coast as kind of like a new place to set up shop. And while it makes a lot of sense economically, one of the issues that a lot of these companies and people who are migrating there as well are going to run into is that the West Coast is already having a very difficult time managing its water supply and how it distributes it to the citizens there. And these big businesses obviously are big energy users, they're big water consumers, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think that we are going to start reaching some really interesting tipping points, aside from, fear of the fact that our world might
the world's on fire, but how is college football going to look?
Exactly, but I do think that that's a real thing. And I know when Seth and I had Bud on, we talked about, rising costs in places like California, starting to squeeze people out of this state and into the Arizonas and the Nevadas and the Washingtons and things like that. So even on the West Coast, even if you take away things like severe storms, just the idea of like water shortages and different other types of supply shortages, these things are going to have maybe not an immediate effect, but definitely something gradually that is going to start changing the way that talent is dispersed around this country when it comes to college football.
Yeah, like you brought up California in particular, and I've made a couple of graphs where it's just like how many kids are getting offered from LA, for example, and you can see this line just starting to drop around like 2015, 2016-ish, because LA is stupidly expensive to live. So you have to move. You want to eat and also have a roof over your head. So they moved to places like Phoenix or Las Vegas, just cheaper to live.
Yeah.
It's actually a really like rising one. So a certain program that you should consider that just got that is going to get hit with NCAA violations is actually like outside of that is probably an attractive program just because like Phoenix right now is pretty good, but probably in the next like 10-ish years, 5-10 years, it'll be much more attractive just because LA people are moving there.
Right.
Yeah, that was actually going to be one of my, it's like something that I've said this before on the podcast, but I had no clue about Phoenix and Arizona until the election of in last November, and how there was this big boom in that state. And I've always wondered how that's going to affect Arizona and Arizona State, because we see Arizona State, obviously whatever is going to happen there with Herm notwithstanding, they've created something interesting there. Whereas on the other side of town or on the other side of the state, you have the Wildcats who they just can't find any solid footing. So like specifically Phoenix and the Arizona area, what are the trends that you've seen coming from that part of the country?
Yeah. So at the moment, at least in the 2021-20 classes, in the 2020 classes, you haven't really seen the big uptick in offers. 2021, for obvious reasons, was a very weird class. So these are kids that graduated earlier this month, high school kids that graduate earlier this month. So if they got a senior season, it was maybe like 4 games or whatever. So that class got a little weird, and the confluence of the one-time transfer rules. Offers are generally a little bit down last year, but yeah, you don't really see it in Phoenix right now. But given the population shifts, particularly in the middle class and lower class people moving from Southern California into Phoenix to try and find jobs and have a roof over their head and live, you would expect that to go in the uptick in the next couple of years. You brought up Arizona. It's actually funny because one of the things I do is like, okay, so Arizona's in Arizona. You expect them to go to LA and Southern California and maybe try and dip into the farms of West Texas. But where are they going? But under Sumlin, of course, he's an A&M and Houston guy. So he was trying to get kids from Houston a whole lot. And I know you don't know American geography super well, Seth, but Tucson and Houston are not close at all. So that was
I got to write this one down. Hold on.
I don't know how long to play this off the top of my head. I've only been west of the Mississippi like once, but they are not close.
So I think that we kind of talked a little bit about through this, kind of where the trends maybe are moving. But one thing that I want to kind of talk to you about is just where the hotspots are in general. When I was in high school, the way it was always understood was like Los Angeles and then obviously California as a whole, due to everybody being very centrally populated in Los Angeles. You have Houston, you have the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you get your Miamis, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and then kind of Louisiana in general, obviously Atlanta. So all of these places, have been established over time as kind of the recruiting hotbeds. Is that still the case, or are your maps kind of showing that maybe some of these hotspots are moving around, or are some getting bigger than what they used to be, or some losing their imprint? Like, what are you seeing when you're looking at that data?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of spots you mentioned, they're still the top 5 are still the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, Houston, Atlanta, LA, and Miami. Those 5 are staying up there. Miami right now is still fine, although it's probably inflated. This is a Richard Johnson talking point, but Miami is probably a little inflated by Florida being over-recruited in general. And what I mean by that is like every Power 5 staff has at least one Florida guy or one Miami guy. And because Florida has this allure of Florida speed, which I'm a bit skeptical of, honestly. A head coach is going to say if you're a Florida guy, hey, why aren't you getting me Florida speed? Why aren't you getting me Florida commits? So you have to go down there and you might reach for a kid who might be a high-end 3-star, and you would reach for him because he's from Florida, but you might not do that if he's from like Birmingham, Alabama, as an example. So those are the big 5, I think. I can't count. Miami, and all the indicators really, so LA might go down, but it's also LA and it's still the hub of a bunch of different industries on the West Coast. So it might dip a little bit, but it'll stay roughly there. Miami has the climate change issue, as we discussed earlier, to open up the show. And Atlanta, Dallas, and Houston, they all benefit from this new thing that's happening. I think it started in late 90s, early 2000s, the new Great Migration. So for those of you that don't remember your American history class from high school, so the Great Migration initially was when the former slaves from down south moved from down south up to the northern cities like Chicago, New York, and they also moved out west to like LA. And we've actually seen this reverse as in like the 90s-ish. So now those Black families are moving back down south into places that are cheaper to live. Raleigh, Nashville, Atlanta, the Texas cities. And so these are the cities that we look and say, okay, these cities are going to be good. And I just want to get a quick thing out of the way. FBS football is a majority of Black sport. So it is important that we pay attention to where Black families are moving. But I do want to make it very explicit, because you get some weirdos on Twitter. This isn't like a eugenics thing.
It sounds like a eugenics thing.
This is what I'm getting out in front. I had someone tell me that Salt Lake City was a race-adjusted superstar. So
that's a take. That is a take.
Yeah, and we can talk about Salt Lake City later. But I want to make it explicitly clear. Like, there have been scientific papers written about this. The Black population in America is not any more athletic than any other population in America. Just the thing is, like, it's an access thing, really. That's really what drives who plays what sports and who you see. Like if you look over in Europe, a lot of this is a big thing in France. Like on a lot of national teams of the Mediterranean countries, you'll have like a bunch of the children of Arabian immigrants on the national teams, because they're poor and the only sport they have, and they don't have much upper mobility. One of those areas is sports, and soccer is really cheap to do. Same football and basketball take up the same role in America. If you want to see this in action, look at the NHL, and then look how expensive it is to buy hockey sticks and how expensive ice time is, and so on and so forth. And then you start to make it out. And so that's why I'm bringing up Black migrations in America, not because any weird things about shin bones being longer, just because it's an opportunity-based thing.
So yeah, I mean, I feel like, when we talk about these things to listeners, maybe you're not like hyper focused on this end of college football, we can all kind of sound like armchair sociologists. And I get the idea of somebody is kind of rolling their eyes when we talk about these things, but it is a real consideration, like, especially when you talk about migration from the Midwest back to the South or further west into the West Coast. It is because cities like Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland and Philadelphia and all these other places are becoming maybe a little bit less industrious and maybe less, appeasing for people who are working class. And that's where you see places like, as you mentioned, kind of the Memphises and the Nashvilles and Charlotte and, your Norfolk, Virginias and places like that, places where you could go get good football players before. It's not like they were, deserts of talent, but they are growing in popularity and in viability for going to build your program in a way that it was not prior. I do think that it's really interesting geographically, as we talk about what's happening in the desert, as we're talking about things like, climate change in the South and along the East Coast. Like, I do think that it's possible that we can start to see even more of a shift in the stratification of talent as a result. I think that, and I think that there are going to be a lot of people who are fans of the sport who may be unhappy about the way that recruiting is going from a national perspective, but it is just going to be a fact of where working class people are living. And because of that, what kind of access these schools have, to talent within their radius.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing. You can go ahead.
So one of the things that I thought was super interesting that was like a kind of like a no shit moment reading your stuff was you talk about basically, in a sense, the difference between Dallas and Houston, in that one of the reasons why Dallas and Atlanta are similar and Houston, even though, like we said, they're all in the top 5, but I believe it has to do with the fact that those are 2 airline hub cities. And therefore it's just easy to get to those cities rather than other cities. So therefore you just access, but in a different way, but you can access recruits in those cities a lot differently than you can other cities.
Yeah. So when I started looking at this, like, as I don't know if I mentioned it, I'm from outside of Philly, so I'm a damn Yankee through and through. I kind of don't like barbecue because I haven't had any yet. That's how much of a Yankee I am. So I know very little about it.
All right, that's the end of the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Philly is I love Philly. Philly barbecue, not great. So I know very little about Texas. So when I was looking at the state initially, I saw that you were seeing a lot of the out-of-state talent. So like when Alabama comes to Texas, when not LSU, when the Florida schools come to Texas, when schools come to Texas, they all go to Dallas. And this was bugging the shit out of me for the longest time when I was looking at it. Like, why are they coming to Dallas and not Houston? And then you look at flights, and flights to Dallas are just a lot cheaper than Houston. And if you have, and again, imagine you have a Power 5 staff and you say, okay, you D-line coach, you're going to recruit Texas. He's not going to just walk to the state and suddenly he's in every part of the state in El Paso to San Antonio, just be able to recruit everyone. No, he's going to go city by city. So he's going to fly where it's cheapest. Then he's going to drive around that little triangle, and then he's going to come back. So he's going to fly to Dallas, then he's going to go to Houston, then he's going to probably hit San Antonio and Dallas and San Antonio and Austin in the same day or two, just because there's not a lot of talent down there. And then he's going to go back to the Dallas. So even if you say he spends 1 day at each stop, he's going to spend 2 days in Dallas versus a day in Houston and a day in Austin and a day in San Antonio, just because that's where he's going to drive. So naturally, because you have to fly into Dallas, because it's really easy to get to Dallas, you just spend more time there. And the same idea goes for Atlanta. I think Dallas is the American Airlines hub and Atlanta is the Delta hub, I want to say. So it's just easy to get to them. And it's really funny.
Yeah, I think one thing with this conversation I do want to do is continue to kind of zoom in and out. So, kind of going from granular to maybe more of a 10,000 foot view. So one of the narratives that I do think is out there a little bit more now when we're talking about college football and recruiting is the idea that these hotspots are even more kind of national recruiting beds than what they were before. Like I remember kind of looking at all of the frustration and irritation from like the University of Texas fans and Texas A&M fans when it seemed like Ohio State was sweeping a lot of their blue chip talent, especially like on the offensive side of the ball out of state. Is that supported by the data? Is it more national now when you talk about schools and who and where they're recruiting versus maybe what it was 10, 15 years ago?
So it's difficult because the reliable 247, so 247, I get my data from 247 Sports, and 247 starts being reliable around 2011. So I don't really have too far of a look back from what I can tell, like kinda. So when people say national recruiting, at least to me, what I hear is, okay, so everyone's going everywhere all the time, and like the Oregon or Washington State is going to start getting Charlotte kids, like no big deal. Boston kids are going to go to USC. Dogs and cats will be best friends. Everything's pandemonium. That's not really how most programs act. Oregon acts like that because Oregon has Phil Knight money. Stanford acts like that because you have to get into Stanford. But really, what most programs do is they still have their footprint. So, like if you're a school in the Southeast, you're going to stay in the Southeast most of the time. Just now, nowadays, you might just jump over to like Dallas, or you might jump over to LA, get a quarterback, come back, but you're still primarily staying in your footprint. So national recruiting, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. Like super regional is a term I thought sounded cool in my head. So to answer your question about is the national recruiting happening more, marginally, I think you might have a couple more programs who are legitimately going national. Ohio State, Oregon, Stanford being some examples. You might have. And with the new TV deals that happened somewhat recently, you might have some sort of super regional, but it's not a very strong signal in the data. Like you'll have Big Ten teams stay in the Midwest, but then also go a lot to Florida and Atlanta and Dallas if they have people down in Texas.
So it's interesting that you put it that way, and I do agree with you, even though I kind of posed the question to you the way that I did. I think that really what's happening now when we're having these conversations is that the top level of recruits, we're seeing the same big brand schools battling for them, where maybe it was a little bit more of, if he's a Miami kid and University of Miami, when they're really good, if they're in on that kid, we're probably not going to take that out to the end. I think that now what we're seeing is more of like, if Alabama, Clemson, and Georgia are battling it out, they're willing to take it all the way into February and try to get those extra visits and try to swing guys as commitments. And I think that we just see a lot of this process happening more publicly now because of social media. So I don't think the idea of decommitments or reopening of recruiting and things like that, it's not new. I just think that we see the timeline stretched out a little bit more because it's in front of us. Bleacher Report covers it, 247 reports on it, Rivals reports on it. It's all over ESPN, and we see it in front of our faces with social media through Twitter and Instagram. So I do think that we kind of get our perspective warped. But when you say super regional versus national, that makes a lot of sense. And then really what we're really talking about too at the end of the day is the way that these staffs are put together. Like one thing that I noticed as a USC fan towards the end of the Pete Carroll era, it was very clear that they had guys on staff, really, namely Ed Orgeron, who had an in the Southeast. And now all of a sudden, a guy like Joe McKnight can come play at USC because Ed Orgeron probably knows his high school coach. Or, while he's out recruiting to Texas and USC has some money, he can say, hey, let me stretch this visit out to my home state. We have talent over here and people trust me over there. I can go pull this kid and get him back. And if we get him to LA, some kid from the middle of Louisiana is going to step foot in LA and be like, oh my God, this is a place for me. I do think that kind of tracks if people actually honed in on where guys are committing to. It's really more super regional than national.
Yeah. I will say your point. You mentioned like, oh, Miami kid's just going to stay in Miami. The idea of like locking down an area, or you've seen the 30 for 30, making the state of Miami,
right.
Sort of a myth. That doesn't, right. Well, it's not a myth. It just doesn't happen anymore because of the more access and programs have lots of money to go wherever. The locking down your backyard is great to get your boosters going and get them to give you money. But in terms of like the material reality, not so much.
I wanted to ask you about kind of Big Ten country because, talking about migration patterns, it's hard not to talk about, like Diante did earlier, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, which is, again, Big Ten country. If the football playing family, the football playing kids are moving out of those places, I guess, what does it mean? Not necessarily for Ohio State, if we're talking about a super regional team, but what does it mean to the other programs, do you think, in the Big Ten, if those cities are maybe not producing as much as they have in the past?
Yeah, so recruiting does get more difficult. A quick thing I want to mention is you see people acting like this is like a last 15 years thing. Like NAFTA was signed in 1994. This was a thing at least 5 years before I was alive. So this has been a thing. But basically, what the issues it rises for different Big Ten programs is that you have to think. Luckily, they have a lot of money, so that makes things a little easier. But you just have to be a lot smarter about your resource allocation. Some places have been bad, like Milwaukee. I don't think was ever great recruiting in the first place. So you either just have to, either use your money really smartly and say, okay, we have this big pile of money. Now we're going to go to the places that are closer. We're going to go to St. Louis. We're going to go to Louisville. We're going to go to Cincinnati. Cincinnati's actually pretty good recruiting. And we're going to focus more in these areas, still have our footprint, but really, try and stretch the limits as much as we can. Or Wisconsin, even though you have a bajillion dollars, say, you know what? No, we're gonna, we'll send some offers down to Florida. We'll send some offers down to Atlanta. That super regional thing we talk about, but mainly, we're going to make sure that we get our big farm boys in Wisconsin and we're just going to develop the hell out of them. And good for them. Just, it does impose when you have the money, but you choose to go that route, you just put a ceiling on your program somewhat.
Okay. And wanted to kind of get you out of here with this, because you are writing, or you've written an article. I guess by the time this comes out, you can go to Coast to Coast Scouting. .com, and you can find your new article, which is on what does and what does not matter in getting recruits. So can you explain, what you found while trying to write this piece? Yeah.
So what this piece is about is from like a program level, what matters in getting good recruiting classes. And the results are basically like B Florida State, or and that's kind of it. Looking at recruiting data sometimes is a little depressing because it's incredibly stable year over year. Like if you have a coaching staff and how he did last year in like his second year, where he has a full cycle, talk to juniors coming up and then gets them to commit. He's probably not going to do like that much better or that much worse the next year. So that's like really stable year over year. So any progress is going to be really slow. Then you say, okay, well, maybe if you win a lot, that'll help attract better recruits at any level of sport. And not really. The way I'll phrase it is this: like if you're Oklahoma and you're consistently winning 10 or more games a year, yes, that will help your recruiting. You will attract better classes on average than if you don't. But if you're Indiana or some other program that's like routinely in that 5 to 7, 7 to 5 sort of range, and you string together a couple of 9-3 or 8-4 seasons, it's probably not going to help you that much because there's a lot of other programs that can do that. Like Purdue can pop off for a little bit. Louisville can pop off for a little bit. Or you think, okay, well, maybe if we develop really well and we get a bunch of kids to the league, then we can use that in our pitch. Like, well, you're probably not putting that many unless you're one of these blue blood programs. So if Louisville puts like seven kids over a 2-year period into the NFL, well, Boston College put 4. That's not that much less. So that's not really much of a pull. So in terms of like what matters, like what programs can do from a macro level to try and attract better recruits is like B, Florida State, I guess. Or one of these blue blood programs. I have like 17 as I define them. It's kind of arbitrary, but it's basically like there's a small subset of teams which get a ridiculous amount of talent no matter what they do. And then there's everybody else. So if you're in that everybody else, the answer is don't get fired so you can get the momentum rolling. Be smart with your resource allocation like we talked with some Big Ten schools. And I guess hope Phil Knight gives you lots of money. I bring up Florida State continually because just to emphasize how big of this recruiting gap is for this like small subset of programs. So Florida State has won more than like 7 games since 2016. Their worst recruiting classes was 2019 and 2020 when they had like 6 and 9 blue chip recruits, so 4 or 5 stars. And since 2019, they've had like 22 or 23 total blue chips. If you go to Utah, who's been a much more successful program since 2015, they've had 20 blue chips. So it's not fair. Like it's just not fair.
All right, so let's stick in Utah. Let's talk about a city in Utah that I really like. That is Salt Lake City. No, we're not going to get into that.
Actually, we can really quickly.
Okay, go Salt Lake City.
Okay, Salt Lake City. Why is football in Salt Lake City good, even though they have lots of white people? 1, shut up. 2, 2. There's a pretty decent sized Polynesian population in the city, and
Latter-day Saints population in Utah. The Polynesian Latter-day Saints community in Utah is pretty big.
Yeah, and why the Mormons decided to send their missions out to the Pacific Islands instead of other places in the world is a very funny story that we will not share on the podcast. Also, there's this is a little pet theory of mine. I'm not entirely sure. History of the Mormon Church, they were like kind of outside the American like the center, and they didn't like that. So they tried to in like in late 1800s, early 1900s, they tried to do things like make themselves more American. One of those was giving a ton of money to the Boy Scouts, and like every Mormon boy had to be a Boy Scout. Football is part of that. So it's just kind of a more ingrained part of Mormon culture that a lot of kids play football, and BYU is right there. And if you're not LDS, you're not going to go to BYU. So, yeah. So that's Salt Lake City is a race-adjusted superstar.
What a quote.
Ridiculous term.
Wait, let me
put that one on Instagram.
We're going to clip. We're clipping that right now.
It's actually my Tinder bio.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to give you the floor with. Is there like another city that was super interesting? Is there another city that you're like, this is the wildest kind of city that you've had to look up because you're seeing something interesting? I know I'm putting you on the spot here.
And let me add to that, just in case you're maybe not able to pick a city. Yeah. Is there a program maybe that is in the vicinity of a growing hotbed that you think may have an opportunity to maybe kind of grow its potential?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll go the fun cities first. This is more of a minutia thing. So if you go down south in a lot of areas, like the best high school programs are all public schools, like South Lake Carroll down in Texas and some other schools I'm forgetting off the top of my head. All of them are public, but if you go to the east in like New York and Philly, they're all Catholic schools. They're all these private Catholic schools that can recruit kids So that's really funny. And you see a similar thing in Detroit. Detroit, we would think because of the new migration, their recruiting get worse. Actually, it's not because of the families and population that is still in Detroit. And Detroit has this like weird like charter magnet school system where basically coaches can scout like Pee-wee and middle school kids and say, okay, well, all the best ones, they're going to go to MLK and Bellevue and a couple other ones I'm forgetting off the top of my head. So Detroit recruiting has actually been really consistent when you expect to drop off like somewhere like Chicago. So that's some interesting tidbits. Oh, and in Texas, I'm going all over the place and I'm sorry. Texas, they have this thing with their high school coaches where you have to like suck up to them, like the Texas High School Coaches Association. Basically, they have this like doctrine where like part of it is like, okay, coaches be involved in your kids' recruitment, so they're informed of what offers they can commit to, what they can't commit to. Keep the recruiters in check that want to give non-committable offers because that's shitty to kids. And the other part of it is recruiters, please suck up to us. Please talk about us when you talk about your Texas recruits. Please be nice to us or you can't talk to our kids. So that's just a funny thing. So when people talk about playing politics in Texas, that's what it is. In terms of programs that are close to good areas, in the area I'm really excited about is Charlotte and Raleigh. They're looking good. The only thing wrong with Raleigh is it's not very big, and there's nothing really with Charlotte. So those areas I feel really good about. So so UNC in particular, because they don't quite have the academic standards that Duke or Wake Forest have. Clemson doesn't really focus on this area. Clemson just goes to Atlanta and wherever else they want because they're Clemson. Are we gonna have to bleep that out?
Oh, you're good.
Okay. And Nashville also is really good. I'm excited about Nashville. So Vanderbilt, if they can, it seems like they're pumping money into the program. That could be exciting for them. And Tennessee, if they ever stop just getting in their own way, that could be a really big boon for them.
Cool. I guess I gave you a little bit of shout outs before where you write, but just in general, tell people where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find my writing on coasttocoastscouting.com. If you want to follow me on Twitter, which I don't recommend because it's a bunch of terrible stuff, and some funny shit posts. It's Conor MCQ5, Conor with one N, CONOR. And that's really it.
Cool. Thanks for coming on. We appreciate this. It was a very, very insightful conversation, I think, about something that I think people who listen to this podcast really want to know. Yeah. So thanks.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.